So, Ellie, we were just joking about this off air because to give some people some sense of time, we are recording this the day after midterm elections. And like you, I too expected us to start this podcast weeping, right? And then completely distraught. But oh no, that red wave that was predicted did not happen. But we're going to dive deep into that. And of course, we're going to dive into your wonderful book. And I'm so glad, by the way, let me just say this quickly, that I listened to the audiobook version of your book. Because my friend, you have a flair for the dramatic. You do this so well. The audiobook version, of course, allowed me to retort a Black guy's guide to the Constitution, which is really phenomenal. But anyway, first, let me ask you a question that I ask every single guest that appears on Jemele Hill is Unbothered. And that is, when did you become unbothered?
Yeah, so the way I usually answer that question is when I became fully emancipated.
Okay, that's a great answer.
Shackles. So probably I'd say the biggest kind of moment for me was my first year at Harvard Law School. I went to Harvard for college, and when I got there, I was surprised at some of the racism that I kind of felt there. I went to, I grew up in the Black neighborhood, but I went to white prep school, so I wasn't kind of surprised. I knew what racism was, but when I got into Harvard, it was very like, oh, you're only here because of affirmative action. I was like, well, I probably standardized test you into a coffin, yo. Like, what are you talking about? So I was really kind of taken off my guard with that, right? So, go through college, things are good, get into Harvard Law School. I'm like, okay, well, surely once I get into Harvard Law School, this will end the whole, like, affirmative action thing. And then the 1L mixer, some white woman from is all like, oh, so we're just talking in a 1L mixer. And she's like, oh, well, I guess affirmative action probably help you. And I was like, and that was kind of like the first, like, I ain't never going to win with these people, right? I never can convince them. I'm never going to win for them. I'm never going to be enough for them. And I don't have to be, right? Like my life does not have to be about proving myself to these people who will always find the next thing wrong, who will always find the next level of criticism or whatever. I don't have to actually care about them. And that was kind of the first, I think, breaking of my chains, my first emancipation. My second one was quite honestly 2016. As Trump is winning, as it's becoming obvious that Trump is going to win, and everybody, my mom's crying, like people are very distraught. It was, I would say before 2016, I was one of those kind of educated Black people who thought that white people, there was only so far they would go. That, like racism was on the retreat, and and so I've had this things that, it's the Van Jones crying on TV, right? It was this kind of Black man who really, Chad would never do this to us, right? Who really thought that there was some limit to how far white people will go. Black women were not surprised, right? Black women were just like, told you about Becky. Like, Black women knew what was happening. And quite frankly, some of my friends who didn't, from my upbringing, who didn't have the educational opportunities that I had, they were also not surprised. They also knew kind of what the real kind of grind of racism was in this country in a way that I feel like I kind of didn't fully accept or realize, because I had white friends and they seemed reasonable and, surely we are beyond this. No, we're not beyond this. And so 2016 was my final kind of like, all right, if this is just how it's going to be, well, then I should probably stop pulling my punches.
So it surprises me to hear you say you were surprised, because pretty much a large premise in your book, A Black Guy's Guide to the Constitution, where you take a very detailed and thorough look of what this constitutional framework is from the perspective of somebody it was never meant to include. And you make the point repeatedly, is like, this is what these motherfuckers do, is like every single time they figure out a way to white supremacy even harder than they did before. So I'm really surprised to hear you say that about 2016.
Well, it's like, this is what they do, right? But I didn't know that they liked it. right? Kind of before 2016, it was like, oh, they just don't know. They just need to be educated. No, they know what they're doing.
Right.
What they know. There's a line in my book that I say, like, tell me that these people didn't think through the Western slave empire that they were trying to create when they wrote the Constitution. Like they put stuff in place on purpose to do this work, and they've continued to put stuff in place on purpose to do this work, because it's not a bug, it's a feature. And that was, that was kind of the revelation that I had, really as I got older, that these things don't, these inequalities, legal inequalities, social inequalities, economic inequalities, these things don't happen by accident, right? This is not the invisible hand. Everybody is a perfect consumer, and it doesn't just work out that way. These are active choices that people are making. Everybody understands the active choices that, like, a politician makes, or everybody understands the active choices that a Ronald Reagan or George W. Bush made, right? But people don't understand that, lawyers and judges are also making active choices to disenfranchise and oppress large swaths of this country in their kind of daily lives.
The thing that's so disappointing about our voting process, and maybe it's always been this way, but maybe now it's just such a degree, it's just unavoidable. But so many people go to the ballot box now to vote against people. They're not voting for things that help them. They're voting so somebody won't get something that could help them. And that is a strange and weird mentality to me to have. You brought up student loans. You've seen the arguments all over social media, just like I have, where there's so many hateful people that really are just like, nah, you just got to be in debt. And it's like, what? And these are the same people who seem to forget, if you've ever used a public library, a public park, any of the public services, especially when you were a kid, you have used that you did not directly pay for. So why then do you get so much joy out of seeing other people suffer? And I don't know, and you could give me your insight, is this a political condition that we will ever get over in this country?
Yeah, I think it's a racial condition that we struggle to get over in this country. So I'll answer this two ways. One, what we see often in that situation is white people proactively voting against things that they think will help black people, even when empirically you can show that either A, it actually helps more white people, or B, it helps white people disproportionately to black people. Even in those two situations, you'll still see white people voting against policies that help them because they think that somebody else is getting ahead. A perfect example of this is affirmative action. Affirmative action, which is about to be destroyed by the Supreme Court. The arguments were actually on Halloween. White people in Clarence Thomas are going to take away affirmative action, even though empirically affirmative action helps white women more than anybody else. And white women will vote against affirmative action because they feel like some black kid is going to get a spot that should have gone to their kid. And it's just not how it works, but you can show them the stats and they don't care, right? So one, it's just that racial lens. I was joking with a friend online. He was like, the choice in this election is one pizza place that serves you lukewarm pizza and another pizza place that serves you broken glass and cyanide. We see empirical evidence of this when we look on the global stage. So one of the things that people, liberals especially, love to point out is Scandinavia. Oh, Scandinavia has social services for this, social services for that. Yeah, Scandinavia is all white. Scandinavia is a largely homogeneous community. And when you live in a largely homogeneous community where you see yourself in almost everybody that you see, it's a lot easier to have collective policies, apparently, right? I promise you that if Scandinavia was 14% black and 26% Latino and 18%. I guarantee you Scandinavia wouldn't look like that. You see it a lot of times in Europe, where we have countries that are literally socialist, have, great social policies, and then as soon as there are a lot of Arab immigrants or a lot of Muslim immigrants, suddenly those social policies are bad, and we got to elect right-wing fascists again, right? Like it happens all over the world, and what it is the false idea that sharing the wealth diminishes somebody else, right? It's the false idea that we live in a zero-sum game, and that any benefits that are given to somebody else necessarily hurt some other population. That's not how economics works. That's not how justice works. This is not how it works. But there are people who really believe that.
Coming into midterms, you know what the narrative was. The narrative was that the Democrats were about to get wiped and that the red wave was coming. And here we are today, and that did not happen. As one headline I read said, it was more like a pink splash. And there was certainly some very noteworthy things that happened. I'm from Michigan, and Michigan took everything. They showed out, and it was historic midterm turnout, particularly in Detroit, which is obviously the biggest city in Michigan. And they took the House, which they had not had in 40-something years. So now it's complete Democratic control. And so we saw these phenomenons, if you want to call it, happen. Why didn't the prediction meet reality?
Yeah, because mainstream corporate media sucks. I mean, let's start with the most obvious. I mean, mainstream corporate media and mainstream corporate polling has been wrong for multiple cycles in a row right now, right? Like, they don't know what they're doing. They don't know what they're talking about, but they know who their owners are, and they know what the board wants to hear, and they know what the CEOs want to hear. And so they relentlessly push right-wing narratives that have no valence on the ground. I swear to God, if I see another poll, it's not just that they don't matter, it's that they're actively trying to push the narrative towards right-wing goals. One, I think, striking graph I saw was the issue of crime, which we have crime in this country. We don't have more crime than other, the crime is a complicated issue. Fox News, 6 weeks for the election, started talking about crime. And then you saw on this graph that the mentions of crime on CNN and MSNBC went up in proportion to how much Fox was talking about it. Fox was the tail wagging the dog on that particular issue, and that's what corporate media does consistently. And so part of the reason why there was this mismatch between expectation and reality is because corporate media is literally trying to feed you the wrong narrative in order to appease Republicans and, for the most part, appease their corporate board. So that's one general thing. The second thing that just has to be said, this is not an American problem. This is a white voter problem. When we look at exit polls, and again, this is not me talking out my bum. This is actual statistical evidence. We see that white people overwhelmingly vote for Republicans, and everybody else doesn't. Right? And the current electoral poll, exit polls that we're seeing, we see 63% of white men are voting for Republican candidates, 53% of white women voting for Republican candidates, and a majority, over 55% majority of everybody else. You break down black men, black women, Latino men, everybody else voting against Republican candidates. So the media becomes, I think, very skewed in terms of talking about white voters without putting that qualification on it, and it overwhelms the narrative, right? So, if you feel like you're about to get wiped out with white voters, you might be. If you probably are, because white people are going to white, but that doesn't mean that you're going to get wiped out in the election if you can bring significant numbers of non-whites to the polls, and if the blowout amongst whites is largely concentrated among white men. If you can be competitive with white women, and you can, basically the numbers, and this is true of just about every election, you got to hold the Republican gains among white voters to around 60%, right? Anything over 60, you're in super danger area, right? But if you're a Democrat and you can get 41, 42, 43% of the white vote, you can win. You can win that election, but the media doesn't talk about it that way. Pundits don't think about it that way because they have an extremely white-centric view of things. They'll say, I mean, I'm sure you've seen the stories too, Jemele, where they'll say like, oh, suburban women are breaking towards Republicans this election. No, they ain't. Suburban white women are breaking towards Republicans this election. And that's a big distinction because there are lots of suburban non-white women who are standing against fascism and against racism and against what the Republican Party is offering.
Well, the interesting thing about that is that the media has no problem segmenting black voters, because one of the other things that we saw as a strong narrative heading into the election was that black male voters were going to cost Stacey Abrams the election in Georgia. Now, Stacey Abrams lost, but as we've seen from the early exit polling, she did not lose because of black men. She lost because roughly 30 to 33% of white people voted for her. To your point about the numbers, there is no way Stacey Abrams can win Georgia if only 30 to 35% of white people vote for her. So the question shouldn't be, why didn't more than 84% of black men vote for her? Because that's about what it was. The question should be, is why the fuck won't white people vote for Stacey Abrams?
Black men showed up for Stacey Abrams, and black men showed up for Raphael Warnock. Remember, before it was like, oh, Stacey's going to lose because black men don't like black. Before that, it was Warnock's going to lose because black men like football. Like, it was the same dumb narrative that was proven wrong by the polls. Black men did. Look, there's always going to be about 10 to 12% of black men who are going to vote for Republican in every election, right? There are black Republicans, right? Did you think Herschel Walker was going to do worse than David Perdue with black men? I didn't, right? So he got the 10 or 12% of black male voters who were going to vote for Herschel Walker or David Perdue or Colonel Sanders they would have voted for if he was running on the Republican line. That's just how that's just how they roll. The rest of us don't truck with that. And the problem that you have when you run in Georgia is, again, that 35 to 45%. Can you close that gap? Warnock twice now has been able to close that gap and keep the white vote for the Republican, around 60%, and that makes him competitive. In 2014, Abrams was able to do that. In 2016, she wasn't, and we should ask questions about why white people were less interested in voting for Stacey Abrams the second time around. I have some thoughts on that. I think as we see often, I like to say there were two truly great articles written in the Trump era about why we're here. One was by our friend Adam Serwer, who did the cruelty is the point, which is just explained it. But the other one was, I'd vote for a woman, just not that woman. I think a huge reason is that white women and white men thought she got a little bit too, what's the word? What's the scientific word for too big for your bridges, right?
Yes.
I almost said uppity, because that's like a
I think a perception that from white people that Stacey Abrams maybe forgot her place is one of the reasons why she underperformed her earlier poll numbers. It's really distressing. But let's also remember Stacey Abrams, and it's not just Stacey. It's Stacey, it's LaTosha Brown, it's a whole host of people that a lot of people don't even know who are on the ground doing this work. But the organization that these people have put together has changed Georgia, and those are benefits that maybe Abrams herself will not be able to reap, but candidates going forward will. Warnock certainly has reaped them. Candidates going forward will reap them, and hopefully it's kind of a model for something that Democrats can do throughout the South. People often forget most black people do not live in New York, right? Do not live in California. Most of us still live in the places where our ancestors were enslaved. Most of us still live in the former Confederacy. And so if you look at the state with the highest proportion of black vote, well, it would be DC if DC was a state. But if you look at this current state with the highest proportion of black voters, it is Mississippi, y'all. And then you go to Louisiana, and then you go to Alabama, and then you go to Georgia, and then you go to North Carolina. What Stacey Abrams has done is, and her organization and people like her, what they've done is to show a strategy for Democrats to be competitive in the Deep South. Democrats could ever replicate that strategy in North Carolina, in South Carolina, in Louisiana, the whole map changes.
No, I think that's a great point, because when you look at, Mississippi in particular, and in some of these strongholds, they have just never been any Black statewide leadership. And, I hopefully it is duplicated, because what happened in Georgia, people didn't think was possible. With that being said, speaking of strongholds, real quick, I want to ask you about Florida. Is there any hope ever in Florida? Because the result was not surprising. People knew Ron DeSantis was going to run away with the governorship. Val Demings, God bless her heart. I got to know Val a little bit when I lived in Orlando years ago. And despite the total incompetency and the disingenuous nature of Marco Rubio, it just wasn't going to be enough. Is there a winning strategy for Democrats in Florida?
Burn it. That's my strategy.
Just lop it off, huh? Just lop Florida off.
No. What I think, and this goes for Texas as well, I do not want to see another non-Latino Democrat run in any of those states at any level for anything for like 10 years, right? Let's just try it the other way, because I am sick and tired of having to watch these races. They come up on the screen and it's like the Democratic candidate in blue and the Republican candidate in red, and the Republican candidate is Latina in these majority or almost majority Latino districts, and we can't find on the Democratic side a Latino to run and represent the Democratic side in these districts. Why? How is that okay? It's not okay anymore, right? Like you're not going to win the Latino vote. You cannot win some of these states, some of these districts without the Latino vote. And we should try at least winning the Latino vote with actual Latino candidates. And I'm saying the word Latino because I'm talking about a few different states. But I mean, let's also drill down to the next level and remember that Latinos do not all come from a place called Latina. All right? They're coming from, first of all, their ancestors came from many different countries. They come from Miami. They come from San Antonio, right? You have to start talking to these different groups as if they're different groups, as opposed to they're one pan group, right? If you look in Miami, obviously you have to deal with Cuban Americans who are kind of preternaturally Republican, and you have to deal with that, right? But there's a huge booming Puerto Rican population in Miami. You got to talk to those people a little bit differently than you talk to Cubans. I'll say, just because this is where my family's from, there's a huge Haitian population in Miami. You got to talk to those people a little bit differently than if they're Puerto Ricans. One thing, for instance, they got to speak French, right? Because Asians even though they're from Hispaniola, they don't speak Spanish in Haiti. They speak French and Creole in Haiti. So you got to speak a different language. You need to, I was saying earlier today, I want to donate to the Democratic Party in Florida a free Rosetta Stone course, so they can learn some different languages and start competing on Spanish language radio, on Creole radio. That's how you win. It's kind of small d, really basic kind of politicking. Going and pressing the flesh and meeting people and meeting people where they are. We don't do that, and we especially don't do that in Florida and Texas. I love Beto O'Rourke. I would love to have a beer with him. I think he's a great guy. We got to stop running white guys in Texas. It ain't never going to happen for us that way. Right? We got to start. It was embarrassing that in 2020 we had 18 different candidates run for the Democratic presidential nomination in 2020. Right? We had Mayor Stop and Frisk. We had Coffin Man. We had all these. We had one Latino candidate. How is that okay? We've got one Latino senator, Alex Padilla, who just won re-election in California. How is that okay? That's not okay. So at some point, if you actually want to compete in Latino districts and Latino and states where the Latino vote is going to make up the base of the Democratic Party, you have to start running Latino candidates.
Well, and not to mention, when you see what the voting patterns are, I mean, everybody made note of the fact that in Uvalde, where Greg Abbott really should never be allowed in that city again, right? But he won that city by 20 points. And it was just wait, this is the same dude that chose to go to an NRA convention instead of coming to Uvalde to meet with people whose children were murdered. He won that city by 20 points. It just says everything.
I can't even explain it, but it does. But it reminds me of Sandy Hook. It reminds me of watching those children, those well-off white children get murdered and having the reaction from the Republican Party be like, price up freedom.
Just to sort of get these last few midterm questions out, Elie, where does the Republican Party go from here? Because they didn't get this red wave that they expected. It's very clear to me that that whole Trump association is not paying off for them. People are sick of the election deniers. You know, I think overall people made it pretty known how they feel about the extremist direction that they are headed. So where do they go from here?
Well, first, they're going to investigate Hunter Biden's laptop because apparently that is a matter of national security.
Yes, even though he holds no position in the government, but all right.
Then they'll impeach Joe Biden because Trump got impeached twice. We have to impeach Biden at least once. It's like literally their logic. So they'll do that. They'll lose. And then we will get into the meat of the run up to 2024. And one of the big losers from election night was the titular king of their party, Donald Trump, because Donald Trump-backed candidates got whooped. Donald Trump-backed candidates did not do well. Donald Trump election deniers did not do well writ large. But who did do well was Donald Trump's chief rival for the Republican Party, Trump with an education, Ron DeSantis. That's the title fight that's being set up. It's like if they get rid of Trump, but they just replace him with DeSantis, is that actually better? Hard to say. I mean, Trump is such a singular, crazy, dangerous person. DeSantis wants all of the same terrible things that Trump does. He's just smarter about going about it. Is that better or worse for America? I don't know. But I think I think what the party wants to do is to move in the DeSantis direction. And that'll be interesting because, frankly, DeSantis is untested outside of Florida, right? We don't know how DeSantis plays in Oklahoma. We don't know how DeSantis plays in Minnesota or in Wisconsin, right? So we'll have to see if that's actually smart for them. But like that's where their party is gearing. The other big loser, Jemele, honestly, from the midterms, Kevin McCarthy. Man, do you really want that job, Kev?
He does not.
To have like a 4-vote majority, and it's going to be like a majority of like Marjorie Taylor Greene and Paul Gosar. Like, is that really a job? Because if you think you want that job, just ask Paul Ryan how he liked having that job. Ask John Boehner how he liked having that job. That's not a fun job, Kev. So I think that I know he thinks he wants it. But I think that it will be a tumultuous 2 years for Kevin McCarthy as potential Speaker of the House. But you know that's where their party is going. They're in it to win it. They're a rump of America at this point. They are. I was just talking about the homogeneity of an apocryphal Scandinavian country. The Republican Party is a homogeneous party at this point, right? It's white and aging and pissed off at somebody, and that is how they've decided to roll with this. That's how they've decided to double down. What they're trying to do, and this kind of gets into my book, is establish permanent one-party minority rule. We have a word for that. It's called apartheid, but like that's what they're actually going for with the voter suppression, with the election denying. They're trying to make it so that only older white votes are the ones that matter. And that is a choice because they've decided to go in that direction instead of actually appealing to the larger community of Americans.
No, of course, as a Democrat, you know that Democrats are very accustomed to, snatching defeat from the jaws of victory. And so now that they have what feels like some momentum. So how do they set themselves up for better in 2024?
Oh, how do they set themselves up for future success? Well, on one thing, when we talk about winners, one person we have to say one was Joe Biden, right? Like, look, he's 8 miles to the right of where I would like him to be on many issues, but you can't kind of objectively deny that his strategy and his agenda were effective, right? The Democrats that ran close to his strategy and close to his agenda generally did well. Democrats that ran away from Joe Biden to the right of Joe Biden generally did poorly, right? Tim Ryan in Ohio, right? He runs away from student debt relief. He runs away from black people in Cleveland and Akron, and he gets his butt handed to him by JD Vance, right? That's a tough race in the best of times, but part of the message here is that Biden kind of has that calibrated just so. So what does that mean for 2024? Well, it certainly means he's running again.
Yeah, I think so. I think this cinched it for sure.
Oh, we should get Gavin Newsom is not going to be the Democratic nominee. Kamala Harris is not going to be the Democratic nominee. Joe Biden and Kamala Harris are running again for president and vice president, and people just need to deal with that in whatever way seems best to them. But like that's what's coming, right? Now, one of the things you look at is under voters under 30 really showed up for the Democratic Party in this election. Voter suppression was in play. We made it hard for them. They couldn't save everybody. But voters under 30 did well, acquitted themselves well. So put it like this, Gen Z acquitted themselves much better than my generation, Gen X, right? Like that's just a truth. So does however old Biden's going to be, I don't know, 82, 115, I don't know. However, does having a very old candidate, is he able to re-inspire young voters to come out and vote for him in 2024? That's going to be a big part of the election. And hopefully that will be a big part of his governing strategy over the next 2 years. Look, if Republicans take the House, we're not getting major legislation on anything, right? We're not getting legislation on anything that you care about. So there's almost no downside or risk for Biden to talk a little bit more aggressively about some of these issues that young voters are begging him to talk about, like climate change, like gun reform and the like.
I mean, it does seem, that we're headed for another rematch, maybe. Like if you're Trump and you see basically your name is not really popping in these streets like they used to be, why would you run again? Why? You know what I'm saying? You might get your ass whooped again. So then, like, what is the upside in doing this again? Now, granted, selfishly, I really want just an all-out death match between him and DeSantis, because I think this is going to be one of the most entertaining battles, and to see Republicans shit their pants about who they should go with. Like, I'm all here for that theater. But if you're Donald Trump, it's like, why? Why would you do this again?
Well, if Trump really won the 2020 election, then he's term limited out and he can't run again.
True.
President under the 20. He's a ridiculous narcissist. That's why he's going to run again. Like he's a desperate, cloying narcissist, and he needs the attention. He's probably one of the only things that has made me happy over the past 2 years is thinking about how sad Donald Trump is, right? Like he's in his Mar-a-Lago, throwing ketchup at the walls, and nobody cares. Not even his Twitter account, right? Like, he needs the attention, and so he's going to run again for attention, which is really the same reason why he ran in 2016 in the first place, right? So, yeah, I think he will run again if he, there's also, health concerns at some point that have to play into the, right? At some point, like, that has to be a consideration, although I don't think it will be for him. DeSantis is a much younger candidate, and it feels like that should matter in a way that it probably won't.
Yeah. Because he'll be younger than when Obama ran, if DeSantis, yep.
And again, America used to matter. America used to think of itself as youthful, and now we don't, and we certainly don't vote like that. So we'll see how that all plays out. I think he's going to run again. I think there's a really good chance that he wins because he has a cult, and even if like establishment Republicans are kind of like because Mitch McConnell hates him. Right, even if establishment Republicans think that they have a better chance with DeSantis, establishment Republicans thought they had a better chance with please clap Jeb Bush, and that didn't work out, right? Republicans thought they had a better chance with Wisconsin's Scott Walker, and that didn't work out, right? Republicans thought they had a better chance with Ted Cruz, and Ted Cruz got his butt whooped, right? So, like, what establishment Republicans care about and what their MAGA cult base cares about is often at odds, and that's where Trump can still clean up, right? Because we know that Trump plays well in Wisconsin. We know that Trump plays well in Pennsylvania. We know that he plays well in Nevada in a way that we don't know where DeSantis is completely untested. So We'll see what happens, and then Biden will walk to the nomination. I hope that he again does what he needs to do to kind of shore up some of the younger vote and some of the energy vote, and then we get to play our game again in 2024. But I will say, Jemele, like we were talking at the beginning about crying, like I did not know when we scheduled this interview that I would be able to come on and credibly feel like we're going to have an election in 2024, right? Because that
it wasn't a given. It really wasn't.
At the beginning of this process, and I feel like now, even though Republicans again will probably take control of the House and still very likely have a really good shot to take control of the Senate, we probably won't really know until December 6th when the Warnock runoff is. But even with those factors, there was not a mandate for election denialism. There was not a mandate for the Republican shenanigans with voting laws. And so I think at the very least, we will have the opportunity to do this all again in 2 years.
In a way, that's better than what I would have hoped for. But in a way, it's also depressing because at some point, I'm like, golly, I'm so emotionally exhausted by this. I'm like, I got to go through this shit again. It would be really nice to, when I went to go vote, I didn't feel like I was voting for my very existence. It would be nice to, like, I don't know, vote on some millages or some shit that, like, I can, like, have some level of calm if it doesn't go my way. But it's just, the process is just really, really frightening. I want to pivot to your book, Allow Me to Retort, A Black Guy's Guide to the Constitution. Everybody who's listening, please get this book. It is not only informative, it's hilarious. Your sense of humor is really wonderful. You know, you make a document that we've all heard about in school and some of us have read or at least know the general cliff notes. You make it endlessly fascinating and entertaining. So I want to make sure that I give you your kudos for that. But what is really interesting to me is the nugget that I read that you wanted Samuel L. Jackson to do your audiobook. How far did you get with that?
Not very far. My people talked to his people, and his people were like, "What? Who the hell is this guy?" And that was pretty much the end of that conversation. We tried to set up a meeting, and no. So, oh well.
Sam, I hate to tell you, you missed out because, like, imagining this in his voice, but it would have been hysterical. But you do a great job. Like the voice changes, you are in this.
Thank you so much. Look, I knew that if it wasn't going to be Sam, that it should be me, because one of the problems when you write a legal book is that a lot of non-lawyers, they think there's going to be all this legal jargon and they think there's going to be all this legalese, and they think that that's going to put the book beyond them. And that's just not what I believe. That's not how I approach the law. I think that it's wrong to approach the law from that perspective. Everybody who is literate, I'm not going to say that law is easy, right? But everybody who is literate should be able to understand the concepts that govern our system of government, right? Like everybody should have that like accessible to them. And so one of the benefits of me reading it is that I can kind of like vocally skip over words that are less important, right? So if I'm saying like, okay, look, strict scrutiny, it's a really complicated thing, blah, 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 blah. That whole blah, 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 like that's actually like legalese that I need to put in there just to like make sure the book is correct and not dumbed down, but it's not actually important to understanding like why a law or a case or a situation turned in the way that it did. And vocally, I think I was able to kind of get people, okay, this part is important, this part is super important, this part is not so much important. Like you can use your modulation to kind of clue people in into what they have to listen to and what they can kind of mentally check out on.
What do you think is the biggest myth that we have about the Constitution?
That it's good. It's not. It's a pretty trash document, quite frankly. No, I mean honestly, people revere this thing. Like it was handed down, like Moses came down with like commandments in the Constitution. No, that is not how it happened. It was written by entirely white, entirely male, generally in their 30s, slave-holding rich people, right? Like imagine if like freaking, Zac Efron and wrote some stuff down and people, oh my God, Zac Efron wrote this script. We can never deviate from. No, that's ridiculous, right? And so, like, Yeah, I'm not saying that the Constitution doesn't have some good ideas. It has some great ideas that have never been applied equally to all the people who were living here, even like for a day. There's some great ideas, but like kind of as a working government document, it has a lot of problems. It has a lot of holes that suggest that it was not actually written by men. I think I heard Senator Mike Lee say, men raised by God to do the work. No, they were not. If they were raised by God, that's an angry God who thinks that it is okay to enslave, a whole continent of people. You hear a lot of people who make excuses for the Constitution say like, oh, well, it's great because it can be amended. Well, part of my book is to show how even the best intentions of amendments can be easily frustrated by the Constitution itself or by the Supreme Court, which gets to have the final say of interpreting those amendments. That's not great. That's not how other countries do it. That's not how they roll in France, right? Which is on like they're like what 27th Republic or something. Like that's not how they do that. Like that's silly. So like that's a huge problem. The idea that we're just talking about the election. Do you realize how just intellectually stupid it is the way that we run our elections, right? We've got 50 different election systems for the same body of government. They're all different in every different state. You can vote on some days and not on other days, and some states have requirements and other states don't have requirements for that. Like, what is that? It's dumb. It's not how you would do it if you were thinking about it kind of rationally, right? But these are people who were writing in a time where to go from New York to California took 3 months and you had to eat gym on the way there, right? So like that was their perspective. And like, all right, the people who wrote the Constitution, they didn't understand slavery was bad. First of all, they did, right? Like, there were lots.
They definitely knew.
They're like, this shit is evil, right? But the other thing that I like to always point out to people is like, who also understood slavery was bad in America in 1787? Black people. If you had asked them, they would have told you, right? So like the idea that, how could they have known any better? I don't know. Ask your secretary, Thomas. Maybe she has some ideas about
right
representative democracy, Thomas, right? So like there are pitfalls and there are holes throughout the document, and that's why I wrote the book, and that's why I call it a Black guy's guide to the Constitution, not a guide to the Constitution for Black people, right? Because it's accessible to everybody. But obviously, I look at the document from this let's say what would be the Don Lemon line, from this openly Black perspective.
Openly Black.
Right? Of like, look at what these people were trying to do. That's not right, and it's not how it has to be.
So, because you are very blunt in how you assess the Constitution, what was some of the backlash you received from this book?
Oh my God, it was stronger than I anticipated, I guess, which is weird. But yeah, I mean, I was on The View, I think, with Sonny, and I said, the Constitution is kind of trash, and Joy Behar was like, "What?" And I was like, I didn't stutter. I said, Constitution, it's like literally the first page of my book, right? Second page of my book is also really good, but like nobody got that far. And like by the time I was getting off set, Jemele, like my phone, it was like it was on fire in my pocket. It was like just like, that hit him, that left a mark. So you get a lot of, like I said, you get a lot of pushback from people who say that the founding fathers and the framers of the Constitution did the best they could. And that's just not true. There were, like I already said, there were obvious better ways to do things that they just ignored because it didn't fit with their white supremacist plan of having a slave empire in the Western Hemisphere, right? It just didn't fit, so they didn't put it in, and that's very obvious, right? Even something as simple as the Bill of Rights, which people love, I think it's good, generally good idea. You know who didn't think it was a good idea? James Madison, the guy who wrote them. Like, the guy who wrote the Bill of Rights didn't think the Bill of Rights needed to be in the Constitution. He was kind of forced into it from a political perspective. And what was he particularly worried about? He was particularly worried that if he wrote down an enumerated list of rights, then some fools in the future would think that those rights that he wrote down were the only rights that existed. Wow. It's almost like he knew what Antonin Scalia was going to say. right? Like, we are now living with the fools in the future that James Madison was worried about, who think that the rights written down in his first 10 were the only rights that exist, and that's why the right to choose is not in the Constitution. No, the right for women to finish their sentences is also not in the Constitution. You want to ask me why? Because of who wrote it and who was allowed to write it and who was allowed to be in the room. So you get a lot of pushback from people who kind of just don't want to accept. And I guess the bigger point here is you get a lot of people who fundamentally don't have a problem with white men writing the laws for everybody else to live under. And I fundamentally have a problem with that. I don't care what the laws are, right? The laws could be, Elie gets free candy and liquor anytime he wants. If that was the law and only white men wrote that law, I'd be like, I don't think it's a great law. We live in a diverse country. We live in a polyglot. We live in one of the most diverse countries ever assembled on the history of the earth. To be governed under a document written by, for exclusively white men is just unacceptable to me. But it is easily acceptable to lots of other people. I made the analogy, I think, in the book, or at least talking about the book, where we literally do not allow 3 black people to judge what white people are doing in any context in this country, right? You can't get 3 black judges at a boxing match if one of the combatants is white, all right? The only white man who has put themselves up to the uncontrovertible judgment of Black America is Eminem. No other white man would do that. So white people kind of instinctively understand that they cannot be judged by all black panels, by all black judges, but they feel free, they feel entitled to do it to everybody else.
I mean, you can't even get that shit on America's Got Talent or The Masked Singer. Like, you can't even get it there, right? Yes. Not even on America's Top Model. Like, none of that. Black people ain't judging white people on shit where it's just us. Like, that is absolutely never happening. It's Eminem and that's it. You have such a brilliant legal mind. Why did you stop practicing law?
Oh my God, I hated it. No. See, when you practice law, you have these things called clients, and it's the client's ideas that you have to represent to the best of your ability. And I respect the hell out of people who can do it. We need lawyers. I'm not a person who makes a lot of lawyer jokes. Like, we need lawyers. It's a noble profession when done right. But I can't be that guy who is like, well, my client paid me a lot of money to defend whatever the hell, and so I'm going to defend it. But I also, like Jemele, quite honestly, couldn't be the guy defending even the causes and the issues and the people that I support and I agree with in a court of law, because when I was in those situations, the pressure was like super high in a way that I just don't feel when I'm writing or on TV or whatever, right? Like, when you're in a room and like there is a woman and she is getting beat by her husband and you need to win the case so that she stops getting beaten by her husband, it's like my whole sphincter would just, it was really difficult for just, that was pressure, right? In a way that I did not want for the rest of my life. So like when you see these like criminal defense attorneys, or my God, when you see attorneys who do appellate work for death row inmates, right? Knowing full well when they lose, their client dies. That's a kind of pressure that there are some people who are able to handle that pressure, and there are some people that are not. And I was just one of those people who was not, right? I can speak to a room with 100,000 people in the room. I'm fine. You put one person in the room and she needs me to fight this white person and win. I mean, it's hard to sleep at night.
Well, Elie, thank you so much for joining me. I know things were hectic the day after the election, but I just absolutely loved your book and I love your analysis on everything. And I'm here for your live tweeting of Supreme Court hearings because they are just filled with facts as well as wonderful observations and entertainment. So I am here for the Elie experience for sure.
I've loved your work since I was, I don't want to date myself. I've loved your work for a long time. I'm so excited to be on the show.